It was the kind of southern summer night that felt heavy in your lungs. July 18th, 2015. The air in Blackwater, Georgia, hung thick and unmoving, wrapped in the scent of damp earth and pine trees. Pastor Elijah Brooks had just finished dinner with his wife, Angela. Nothing seemed unusual. He laughed at something on the evening news, kissed her on the forehead, and said he was going down to the river for a little while. Just need some quiet, he told her. That wasn't strange. The river had always been his place to think, to pray, to breathe when the weight of the world felt too heavy. Blackwater River ran slow and dark behind the tree line, about a mile from their home. Locals said the water looked black at night because it reflected nothing. No moon, no stars, just endless shadow. Elijah had walked that dirt path hundreds of times before. He knew every bend in the trail, every broken branch, every dip in the ground. He often brought a small flashlight, but that night he didn't. He didn't plan on staying long. Just a few minutes alone with his thoughts. Around 9:30 p.m., a neighbor later reported hearing what sounded like raised voices drifting from the direction of the riverbank. At the time, no one thought much of it. Sound carries strangely across water. It could have been teenagers messing around, or fishermen arguing about bait. But looking back, the neighbor would swear one of the voices sounded tense. Urgent, like someone trying to reason with another person. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Angela called Elijah at 10:07 p.m. when he hadn't returned. It went straight to voicemail. She wasn't worried yet. Sometimes he lost track of time when he prayed. But by 11 p.m., a quiet unease settled into her chest. The house felt too still. The crickets outside seemed louder than usual. She tried his phone again. Nothing. At 11:43 p.m., she called the sheriff's department to report him missing. Deputies told her to wait until morning. He probably just needed space, they said gently. At sunrise, two fishermen launching their aluminum boat near a shallow bend spotted something caught in the roots of a fallen cypress tree. At first, they thought it was debris, maybe a bundle of clothes or driftwood tangled in the current. But as they drifted closer, the shape became clearer. A body, face partially submerged, one arm twisted unnaturally against the bark. The river moved slowly around him, almost peacefully, as if nothing violent had ever happened there. By 7:12 a.m., the call came into dispatch. By 7:26, deputies were on scene. And by 8:03, the town of Blackwater would begin waking up to news it never saw coming. Elijah Brooks wasn't the kind of pastor who kept his sermons safe and predictable. He believed faith wasn't just about Sunday mornings, it was about accountability, justice, and standing up when something felt wrong. Over the years, his congregation grew not just because he was charismatic, but because he was fearless. He talked about poverty in a town that pretended it didn't exist. He talked about addiction when families wanted silence. And in the summer of 2015, he started talking about something far more dangerous: power. It began with a land deal. A massive redevelopment project was announced just outside Blackwater: luxury townhomes, retail space, promises of economic growth. On paper, it looked like progress. But longtime residents knew what it really meant. Families who had lived there for generations were being pressured to sell. Property taxes mysteriously increased. Code violations suddenly appeared on homes that had stood untouched for decades. Elijah met privately with several of those families. He prayed with them at their kitchen tables. He listened. And then he started asking questions publicly. One Sunday morning, just 3 weeks before his death, Elijah delivered a sermon that people still talk about in hushed tones. He never mentioned specific names, but his words were sharp. "When wolves wear suits," he said from the pulpit, his voice steady but intense, "they expect the flock to stay quiet." The sanctuary went still. Even the air felt tight. Some members shifted uncomfortably in their seats because they knew exactly who he was talking about: a powerful real estate investor with deep political connections, and a city council member who had championed the project from the start. After that sermon, things changed. Elijah began receiving late-night phone calls. No one spoke on the other end, just silence and faint breathing before the line clicked dead. One afternoon, he found an envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words typed in bold black ink: "Stay in your lane." He didn't report it. When Angela asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off with a tired smile. But she noticed he started double-checking the locks at night. She noticed he paused longer before answering unknown numbers. Behind closed doors, Elijah confided in a close friend that he believed someone was watching him. He mentioned a black SUV parked across from the church more than once during the week. It never stayed long, just long enough to be noticed. He wasn't paranoid by nature. In fact, he was steady, grounded. But there was a weight in his voice when he spoke about it, like he understood he had crossed an invisible line. And still, he refused to step back. "If I don't say it," he told his friend quietly, "who will?" By 2025, most people in Blackwater barely spoke Elijah Brooks' name anymore. Time has a way of sanding down sharp memories, turning outrage into something quieter, easier to live with. But Maya Reynolds didn't live in Blackwater. She lived in Atlanta, where she hosted a growing investigative podcast focused on cold cases the system had quietly buried. She had built a reputation for reopening stories that others considered finished. When she first came across Elijah's file while scanning archived county records, it was just supposed to be background research for a broader episode about questionable accidental deaths in small-town America. At first glance, the case looked ordinary. Middle-aged male. No criminal record. No apparent enemies. Drowned in a river he knew well. Tragic, but not suspicious. Yet something about the timeline nagged at her. The official report stated that deputies arrived at the riverbank within minutes of the fisherman's call. But according to dispatch logs she obtained through a public records request, there was a 22-minute gap between the initial sighting and the logged arrival time. 22 minutes unaccounted for. In most investigations, that might not mean much. But in a town with only 3 patrol units on duty that morning, it felt off. Maya dug deeper. She requested the autopsy photos and medical examiner's notes. The report mentioned minor bruising on Elijah's right wrist and forearm, consistent with contact against submerged debris. The wording was careful, clinical, but Maya had interviewed enough forensic experts over the years to recognize cautious language when she saw it. Bruising from river debris usually appears scattered, random. These marks were concentrated, almost like pressure had been applied. She contacted a retired forensic pathologist who reviewed the notes and told her, off the record, that could also be consistent with someone grabbing him. The deeper she looked, the more resistance she encountered. Several documents she requested were marked as destroyed due to retention policy. Evidence logs were incomplete. Bodycam footage from responding officers was unavailable. The department claimed cameras hadn't been issued to deputies until 2016. Even the original 911 recording Angela made the night Elijah didn't come home had been partially erased due to a storage malfunction. Each missing piece on its own could be coincidence. Together, they felt like erosion, as if someone had slowly washed the edges off the truth. Then came the evidence inventory list. Most items were standard: wallet, wedding ring, shoes, clothing. But at the bottom, nearly forgotten in faded ink, was a single entry: cellular device, water damaged. No further notes. No digital extraction report. No documentation that anyone had ever attempted to access it. When Maya called the sheriff's office to ask about it, the records clerk sounded surprised it was still listed. "If it's still here," the clerk said, "it's probably in storage." And that was when Maya decided to drive to Blackwater herself. The evidence storage room at the Blackwater Sheriff's Office smelled like old paper and dust. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with cardboard boxes labeled in fading marker, years of forgotten arrests, closed cases, and lives reduced to inventory numbers. A clerk led Maya to the back corner where a small, dented box sat wedged between 2 larger containers. The label was barely legible: Brooks, Elijah, personal effects. It didn't look important. It didn't look like something that could reopen a decade-old case. But when the clerk sliced the brittle tape and folded back the flaps, there it was, a black flip phone sealed inside a plastic evidence bag, water stains clouding the surface. It was outdated even in 2015. Cheap model. No passcode lock noted in the report. The battery had long since corroded, and faint rust lined the charging port. The sheriff's office claimed they had no record of attempting to retrieve data from it. "Back then, we didn't have the tools," the clerk said with a shrug. But Maya knew that wasn't entirely true. Even 10 years ago, basic data extraction was common in accidental death investigations. Especially when timelines were unclear. Especially when a man had received threats before he died. Maya took custody of the device under a formal evidence transfer request and drove it straight to a digital forensics specialist in Atlanta named Chris Mallory. Chris had worked federal cases involving everything from financial fraud to homicide investigations. When he saw the condition of the phone, he raised an eyebrow. If this was submerged for hours, the internal boards probably fried, he said carefully. Still, he agreed to try. The device was dismantled piece by piece under bright lab lights, each component photographed and catalogued. Corrosion was cleaned with specialized solution. The memory chip was carefully removed, dried, and connected to a reader. For 2 days, nothing came up but fragmented system data, corrupted files, unreadable timestamps. It looked like the river had done its job. But on the 3rd day, Chris called Maya and asked her to come back to the lab. His tone was different, not excited, not alarmed, just focused. On his computer screen was a partial file directory that hadn't shown up before. Buried under damaged folders labeled audio, there was a single entry with a timestamp from July 18, 2015. 9:42 p.m. The file name wasn't custom. It was auto-generated by the phone. VM_071815_2142. The file wouldn't open at first. When they tried to play it, the speakers emitted nothing but harsh static. But Chris wasn't ready to give up. He ran the file through recovery software designed to reconstruct fragmented audio data. Slowly, the waveform began to form on the screen, uneven, distorted, but real. It wasn't empty. Something had been recorded that night. The timestamp placed it less than 30 minutes before deputies claimed Elijah entered the water. As the software stabilized the audio just enough to attempt playback again, Maya leaned closer to the speakers. Static filled the room at first, thick and overwhelming. And then, beneath the distortion, there was breathing. The lab went completely silent when the breathing became clear. It wasn't background noise. It wasn't interference. It was human, uneven, shaky, too close to the microphone. Maya felt her pulse in her throat as Chris adjusted the audio levels, filtering out layers of static inch by inch. The sound sharpened just enough to distinguish movement, faint gravel crunching underfoot, the soft rush of river water in the background. It wasn't a voicemail someone left him. It wasn't a call. Elijah had pressed record himself. For several long seconds, there was nothing but air and distant water. Then Elijah's voice came through, low, strained, barely above a whisper. If something happens to me, the words cracked, like he was trying to keep control. Static swallowed part of the sentence before it cleared again. It wasn't the river. Maya's breath caught. The timestamp confirmed this was recorded less than half an hour before his body was found downstream the next morning. He sounded alert. Not drunk. Not disoriented. Afraid. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Approaching from behind. The microphone shifted slightly, fabric brushing against it as if the phone had been lowered but left recording. A second voice entered the frame, distant at first but unmistakably male. Calm. Controlled. You should have stayed out of it, Pastor. The words were clear enough that even without enhancement, the tone carried authority. There was no shouting. No chaos. Just quiet certainty. Like this conversation had already been decided. Elijah responded, louder now, panic bleeding into his voice. People are going to find out. The sound of water splashing lightly at the river's edge suggested they were standing close, too close. Then the movement became chaotic. Gravel scattering. A sharp exhale. The microphone scraped hard against something solid. Static spiked as if the phone had been jolted violently. Overlapping sounds filled the recording, heavy breathing, a grunt of exertion, fabric tearing. At one point, Elijah gasped something unintelligible, cut off by what sounded like a body hitting shallow water. But the most chilling detail came seconds later. After the splash. After the struggle. When the chaotic movement faded into the steady rush of the river again. Through the distortion, another sound emerged, not water, not wind. A metallic click, followed by the hollow slam of a car door closing somewhere nearby. The engine didn't start immediately. It idled for a moment, low and steady, before fading into the distance. And the recording kept running, capturing nothing but the river moving slowly in the dark. Once the audio was stabilized as much as possible, Maya knew the next step couldn't be handled quietly. The second voice on that recording wasn't just background noise, it was evidence. Real evidence. She forwarded a secured copy to a federal audio forensics lab that specialized in voice comparison. The process was slow and technical, involving frequency mapping, speech pattern isolation, and waveform alignment against known voice samples. Weeks passed with no update. And during that time, word about the existence of the tape began to circulate quietly through Blackwater. When the preliminary analysis finally came back, it didn't name a suspect outright, but it narrowed the field. The cadence, tone depth, and speech rhythm suggested a male between 35 and 50 years old at the time of recording. Southern dialect. Educated. Controlled vocal delivery. The lab requested comparison samples from individuals connected to the original investigation. That meant deputies, first responders, and anyone documented as present at the scene in 2015. It was a sensitive request. Some in the sheriff's office resisted, calling it unnecessary. Others claimed the case had already been ruled accidental and saw no reason to revisit it. But pressure was mounting. Maya's podcast teaser announcing new evidence had already drawn national attention. Under growing scrutiny, the department quietly complied. Archived body cam test recordings, training simulations, public press conference clips, all were submitted for analysis. One by one, the lab compared voice prints to the recording pulled from Elijah's phone. Most were eliminated quickly. No match in tone structure. No alignment in speech markers. Then one waveform aligned almost perfectly. Deputy Sheriff Carl Whitmore. In 2015, Whitmore had been one of the first officers at the riverbank. According to reports, he secured the perimeter and conducted the initial visual assessment of the body before the medical examiner arrived. He was also the deputy who wrote the first narrative summary describing the scene as consistent with accidental drowning. At the time, no one questioned it. Whitmore had a clean record. 15 years on the force. Respected in the community. The kind of officer people trusted without hesitation. When Maya learned the lab had identified a high-probability vocal match, she didn't release it immediately. She requested an interview with Whitmore first. He agreed, perhaps assuming the tape was too damaged to be definitive. Sitting across from her in a quiet diner off Highway 17, Whitmore appeared calm. Confident, even. But when she played a cleaned segment of the recording, just enough to hear the phrase, "You should have stayed out of it, Pastor," something shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't panic. It wasn't outrage. It was recognition. And for a brief second, before his expression reset, it looked like calculation. Deputy Carl Whitmore was arrested 48 hours after Maya's interview aired. The official charge was obstruction of justice pending further investigation, but everyone knew it wouldn't stop there. The audio match had given federal authorities enough leverage to bring him in for questioning. At first, he stuck to the same version of events he'd written 10 years earlier. Accidental drowning, no signs of foul play, nothing unusual about the scene. He claimed the tape was distorted beyond reliability. Claimed the voice wasn't his. Claimed coincidence. But investigators had more than just the recording now. Financial analysts began digging into Whitmore's bank history around the summer of 2015. What they found raised immediate red flags. In the months leading up to Elijah's death, Whitmore's accounts showed routine deposits consistent with a deputy's salary. But 2 weeks before July 18th, a wire transfer for $18,500 appeared from an out-of-state LLC. 3 days after the drowning, another deposit followed, $12,000. Both labeled as consulting services. Whitmore had no registered side business. No consulting license. No explanation that held up under scrutiny. Under mounting pressure, his composure began to crack. During a late-night interrogation session, after hours of silence and carefully placed evidence photos sliding across the metal table, Whitmore finally spoke differently. He admitted to meeting Elijah at the river that night. Claimed it was meant to be a warning. "Just scare him," he said. "Make him back off the development deal." He insisted there was no plan to kill anyone. Said things escalated. Said Elijah slipped near the bank during the struggle. Said he panicked. But there was something investigators couldn't ignore. On the tape, just seconds before the chaos began, Elijah's voice had said something barely audible beneath the static. Audio engineers enhanced that section repeatedly until the words became clearer. "You're not the one in charge." That sentence changed everything. If Whitmore had only been there to intimidate him, why would Elijah say that? It implied authority above him. Direction. Someone else calling the shots. Digging deeper into the LLC that wired Whitmore the money revealed it was a shell company, registered in Delaware, managed through layered subsidiaries. Eventually, the trail led to a private security contracting firm with ties to large-scale real estate acquisitions across the Southeast. The same conglomerate behind the Blackwater redevelopment project. The same project Elijah had publicly opposed. Internal emails subpoenaed during the investigation showed executives discussing community resistance issues weeks before his death. One message included a line that sent a chill through federal prosecutors. Local obstacles must be handled discreetly. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, one question remained unanswered. Cell tower data from that night indicated another phone had been active near the riverbank at the exact time of the recording. It didn't belong to Elijah. It didn't belong to Whitmore. The number was registered under a prepaid account, activated only weeks before and permanently deactivated 2 days after the drowning. Whoever owned that phone was never identified, which meant that even with Whitmore in custody, even with financial trails exposed and confessions partially given, there was still someone else who had stood by that river in the dark, someone who had never stepped forward, never been seen, and had never been recorded clearly enough to be named. For 10 years, the people of Blackwater believed the river had taken Pastor Elijah Brooks. They believed it was a tragic accident, a quiet night, a misstep in the dark. But rivers don't erase truth. They hide it. And sometimes, they wait. The hidden tape didn't just reopen a case. It exposed how easily power can bend a narrative. How quickly a life can be reduced to paperwork. How silence, when protected long enough, starts to look like fact. Deputy Whitmore is behind bars, awaiting trial. Federal investigators are still tracing financial records, still peeling back layers of shell companies and private contracts. The redevelopment project stands where old homes once did, polished, expensive, and silent. But late at night, when the air hangs heavy over Blackwater River, some locals say they can't drive past that bend without thinking about what happened there. About the breathing on that tape. About the voice that said, "You should have stayed out of it." And about the sentence that still echoes louder than anything else. "You're not the one in charge." Because if Whitmore wasn't in charge, then someone else was. And that someone is still out there. Microphone # sometimes the truth doesn't drown. It waits to be heard.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.